What's going on, everybody, and welcome to, as of today, the fourth one of these unknown Book Binge video reviews, because I don't know when it's coming out. I'm just recording it because I have the ability to, and I don't have my schedule planned out for the next several months, and don't want to this time around because I know some things are going to change over the end of 2023. But either way, this week we are reviewing a book that I read in, oh, when was it? Good grief. It would have been, what, July? Maybe August of 2022. So this review is actually probably coming out upwards of 2 years after I read the book. This is The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, a book that I know tons of people who adore, but then I didn't actually love it quite as much as all of them did. That's not necessarily a bad thing, that's fine, but I will just kind of put that out there at the very beginning of this video. Like I said, I have plenty of friends who love this thing, but let's talk about first the good of the book, the things that I did enjoy, the things that I do think are absolutely worthwhile in the reading of the book. I think that The Picture of Dorian Gray and Oscar Wilde's story here is primarily a good character study. The characters that are interesting in the book are some of the more interesting characters in fiction in general, and I've heard of some people whose some of their favorite characters just ever in a story come from this book. I see why. I don't necessarily share that opinion, but I totally see why some people might think that way. It reveals the book with the character study, with the exploration of the characters, reveals certain aspects to the nature of man that are really interesting and intriguing, and I think that are thoughtful and are totally worth, existing in the way in which they exist. But this comes especially with the corruption of pride or of self-worth. These ideas specifically, when they're involved in the story, are the ones where this, the exploration of the nature of man are the most impressive in the story. I think that the thematic undertones are great as well, and a lot of these are also shared by those, the exploration of the nature of man, especially tonally. The tone of the story really sells the thematic undertones as well. They didn't fully work for me all of the time, but there's definitely some stuff to get out of the book. I think if I reread it, I might enjoy it a little bit more because I would know what I'm expecting, and would be able to dive deeper into the themes. And I think over the last couple years, I've generally just gotten better at reading things that aren't quite so straightforward and understanding them a little bit better, and understanding that's a okay thing, that I don't have to be reading a book wholly for the story, because when I read this, I might have expected it to be a little bit more of a story as well, when it is much more of a character study, like I mentioned. And probably the most impressive thing of the book in general is the way the painting of the story, the picture of Dorian Gray, represents the story in a sort of metaphorical way, coinciding with the themes. This aspect of the book was very engaging, but on the other hand, there are a few things that I will point out as being very not good in comparison about the picture of Dorian Gray. First off, chapter 11 in this Penguin Classics edition is just bad. It's so bad. It's one of the worst chapters I've read in much of anything at this point. It's kind of pointless and endless and made me want to die. Granted, I was also reading this while I was just recovering from my wisdom teeth operation, so I was kind of like drugged up and tired and sleepy in general as well. Maybe that affected part of my experience with the story, but I was reading another book at the same time, and I was enjoying that very well. So I don't know what didn't work, but chapter 11 of this book I actually did just skim a lot of, and actually skipped a couple pages because it was just so pointless. And even skipping a couple pages was like, clearly there's nothing here that's worth reading. Chapter 11 is just bad in this version of the book. And speaking of this version of the book, that is another point that I want to make. There are essentially multiple versions of the story. I hate this kind of thing, just generally speaking. Two versions of a book for an abridgment, or an initial version plus an unabridged or director's cut version, is fine. So like, say having any old really long classic and then an abridged version is fine, even if I tend to disagree with abridged versions of books in general. And then maybe having a original version of a book like The Stand by Stephen King, and then a director's cut, essentially, that includes a little bit extra material, is also fine. But once there's multiple cases of material that are in some versions but not in others, and especially when the differences between them can be very situational between the version of the book. It's just a nuisance. It's annoying, and that's part of what the foreword of this book is about, is talking about the different versions and what certain material is included in this versus what wasn't included in the first publication, and then in some other publications. It's just confusing. So like, I guarantee that this version of the book maybe isn't the same version as some of the people I know read, and maybe that affected part of my enjoyment versus their enjoyment. Who knows? I just hate that that is a thing. But on a more story focused front, I would say probably my biggest issue with the book, despite liking character exploration and the ideas of the themes with the painting and all of that stuff, all the characters besides Lorien lacked any sort of depth that I personally recall caring about at all, and that really affected my, that really affected the story for me. I know there are plenty of people who love some of these other characters, some of the characters that aren't Dorian and are some of their favorites. I didn't connect with basically any of them, unfortunately. In terms of the ugly, though, I didn't like the prose for some reason. Tons of people love Wilde's prose. I know a lot of people who read this book that were just like, maybe this book itself isn't the best, but I just loved it because I loved reading it. And I didn't. I just didn't love reading it. That's part of why I skipped part of chapter 11. Even in a book like Les Miserables by Victor Hugo, where there are tangents that just don't really matter, I still generally enjoyed reading it because that prose, then again, part of that was the translation too. I just loved the writing of it. It was great. It was beautiful. It was easy to read, and it didn't sacrifice the tone of the story. Whereas this Wilde's prose in here is just, it's fine. It's fine at best for me personally, at least. Like I said, tons of people love it. I didn't really connect with it. Overall, I do think that the book was just kind of forgettable for me. I have a couple of scenes and moments that are hard-baked in my memory when I think of the book, but the rest of it I generally just don't really remember that much of. Just as an example of describing what, the sort of forgettability of the book is for me, for a while there, I was reading at least one classic basically every single month, and what I would do is sometimes I would go through from the very first classic that I read in this sort of monthly classics read-along thing with Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, go through in which books I read each month. Inevitably, I almost always forgot this book in that list, and I'd be like, wait a minute, there's a book missing there. I read a book in that month, I know I did, what was it? And I'd have to look at my shelves and realize, oh yeah, it was this book, and I just forgot that I read it. So that is the biggest indictment of the book for me, is that I didn't find it super memorable. I didn't find it super great. It was just kind of fine. But in terms of the recommendation, as I've mentioned a couple times, I know a lot of people who love this book. I have a couple friends who it's amongst their favorites, and I'm one of the only ones, it seems, who like actively disliked it, especially the way that I do. So I do recommend giving it a shot for that reason. People love the prose. Generally, people love the story. People love the book, even if I didn't. That's perfectly fine. And even though it didn't work for me, it seems like the majority of people do really enjoy it, so I recommend giving it a shot, even if I didn't like it. It wasn't for me. It wasn't for my taste. That's fine. At least the book is somewhat short, although on that point it felt a lot longer than it actually is for me while I was reading it. That was kind of a problem for me, but yeah, most people enjoy it, so I recommend giving it a shot, but it just didn't work for me is all. Like I mentioned, to be fair, part of this could be the fact that I read it while recovering from my wisdom teeth surgery, but I was also reading another book that I was enjoying quite a bit at the same time, so I have no idea what was exactly going on with that. But thank you for checking out this video if you did. I have no clue what's coming out next because I don't know what episode of the Book Binge this is. So I'll see you guys in the next video, whatever it is.